My name is Pam Deutsch, and I am from the Brian Lamb School of Communication here at Purdue University. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our next set of presenters. We actually have 4 undergraduate students, 1 sophomore and 3 juniors, from 2 different Indiana universities that are going to be debating for you today. Their topic is that encryption technology should have backdoors. Indiana University, on this side, is going to be affirming the resolution, so they're going to be in favor of the backdoors. Andrea Dragas is a sophomore studying law and public policy with an education policy minor, and she also competes in Model UN. Ben Talley on this side is a junior pursuing dual degrees in public policy and informatics. This is his 3rd year on the IU debate team. The coach for the IU debate team is Brian DeLong. Brian is responsible for the resurgence of public policy at IU beginning in 2010. Before he coached at IU, he coached 2 debate teams to national championships, one at Wake Forest University and one at the University of Kansas. Now, Purdue University, to your left, will be providing the arguments against having backdoors. Adam Hassanin has been on the debate team, for 3 years. I just call him Adam. I never use his last name. In addition to competing in parliamentary debate, he also does Lincoln Douglas debate, and he studies political science. Alan Min has also been on the Purdue debate team for 3 years. He competes primarily in parliamentary debate and is studying computer science. The coach of the Purdue's team is James Mollison. In addition to coaching for Purdue, he has worked with programs at the University of Michigan, Gonzaga, and Loyola Marymount. He is currently a PhD student in philosophy here at Purdue. The debate will open with each speaker, alternating for and against, giving a speech, and then it will be followed by a questioning by a member of the opposition. After these 4 speeches and 4 cross-examinations, each team will have a chance to present 1 rebuttal that will summarize the affirmative and the negative position for the entire debate. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Ben to come to the stage, and he will be opening with the first affirmative constructive that will be giving the reasons that we should be having backdoors for encryption technology.
Thank you for that introduction, and Andrea and I would like to thank all the great folks who put this conference together. If everybody's ready, then I'll begin. At this conference, you will hear a lot about the dangers and potentials of technology in an uncertain future. Because of rising global insecurity, Andrea and I affirm that resolved encryption technology should have backdoors. Before delving into details, I'll note that the word should in the resolution implies immediacy. That means we are not discussing utopian ideals, but the concrete circumstances of the status quo. A backdoor is a way to bypass authentication in a product or system that stores encrypted data. It was flung into public consciousness last year when Apple refused to give the US government a backdoor into the phone of the San Bernardino attacker. It's understandable why people would be worried about that, but is it really better for privacy that corporations interested only in profit prohibit institutions built to keep us safe from accessing relevant data, and that corporations should be allowed to break the law and delay justice whenever they want? According to the Daily Beast, Apple has already unlocked iPhones for the feds on 70 occasions since 2008, which they openly admit to. The terrorist attack gave them a great PR opportunity, but it was not a litmus test for privacy. Sorry, but the public and private sectors are both spying on you already and exchanging your data. Embracing backdoors will create transparent and negotiated standards that can restore public-private trust and make clear what the state's authority is. As explained by James Lewis, a director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former officer at the Departments of State and Commerce, this backdoor precedent can be applied globally and lead to multilateral agreements. This creates a global framework for privacy protections and cooperation on security issues, including intelligence sharing. And that brings me to the point I believe is more important. A backdoor, when used responsibly by law enforcement, is an effective measure against the worst kinds of crimes, such as terrorism, cyber attacks, and human trafficking. Legal mechanisms tend to get caught up in political and administrative hurdles, which allow them to be outpaced by fast-growing technology. We cannot allow that to happen with regards to our security. Moving and stored data are increasingly encrypted, which means the process is no longer as simple as obtaining a warrant and accessing the necessary evidence to prosecute or prevent an attack, even with the lawful authority. The FBI Director James Comey describes this phenomenon as going dark. The law governing interception of communication is the CALEA, which is 20 years old. That is obviously not sustainable. We cannot let misplaced concerns get in the way of keeping our society safe. This is especially true as dangers are on the rise. A report released by the House Homeland Security Chairman Michael McCaul in 2015 shows there were more attacks in that year than any year since 9/11. There has been a threefold increase in just 5 years. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the increasingly devastating lone wolf and coordinated attacks we've been seeing more frequently in the last year, including the tragedies in Paris and Orlando. Any communications or data that can help identify attackers is obviously useful, but intercepting encrypted data is even more specifically useful to deter cyber attacks. First, attacks are interfering with our election. This is not internal whistleblowing, but an outside agitation aimed at undermining the legitimacy of our democracy. Second, attacks on businesses from hackers in rogue states like North Korea have skyrocketed in recent years, according to the Department of Justice and the World Economic Forum, which ranks cybercrime as a top threat. Malware attacks are up 40% from last year, and cybersecurity complaints have risen 1,500% since 2000. Third, cyber terror attacks are on the rise. Lieutenant Colonel John Brennan explains that security strategies are falling behind the work of organizations like Al-Qaeda, saying there is irrefutable evidence they use online communications to recruit, raise funds, and increase their capabilities. Their investment into technological education also risks potential for attacks of untold devastation. The internet can be used to pilot unmanned aircraft carrying explosive, chemical, or biological payloads, as an example. Phone data has also been empirically shown to convict criminals who otherwise wouldn't have been caught, and has also exonerated innocent people. Now, we have to err on the side of caution. No technology is perfect, but a backdoor is the strongest defense available to protect the most vulnerable victims and the nations as a whole. James Lewis, cited earlier, explains how this is a constantly evolving offense-defense game, and it needs continued pressure. There is absolutely no replacement for surveillance, especially because the unknown terrorists pose the greatest risk. Our final argument is that a backdoor can spur technological innovation. The negative team will probably throw into question the impact on businesses, but we believe in a world of a cooperative yet agonistic relationship between the public and private sectors and checked by civil society. In that world, a backdoor can create a race to the top. In response to the status quo's anti-encryption measures, Google and Microsoft are already working on quantum encryption, according to Wired. Imagine the spillover effects of these kinds of innovations and the worldwide security apparatus if international standards on encryption push firms to invest in these technologies before our enemies do. For these reasons, Andrea and I affirm the resolution. I'm now ready for cross-examination.
So, could you please describe how a backdoor might work?
Sure. So a backdoor, it can be any number of mechanisms with regard to like the actual software, but it just means access into the data that was otherwise encrypted.
So is there like a key that someone has access to that gives them access to the backdoor itself?
Right, so you can make an argument about vulnerabilities, but we're going to win that first of all, the security checks that well-prepared organizations like the FBI are able to outweigh that and keep it under control.
Okay, so what devices might your backdoor encryption affect? So like Apple phones,
Yep.
like MacBooks?
Yep.
So basically just stuff in the US, right?
Stuff in the US, but we think that a backdoor is a good idea just in general in the developed world, not just in the
So
US.
how would we enforce a backdoor on other countries, seeing as we're the United States?
Sure. So our argument is not that we're forcing their hand or anything. It's that we create conditions for global modeling because other countries want this too. For example, France, Germany, Canada have also expressed interest. So if we can create multilateral agreements, then that kind of gets everybody on board and it is the best case scenario.
Okay, so you talked about quantum encryption in one of your points. Would quantum encryption also have a backdoor?
No, that's the point, is that it's a much better kind of encryption than
So
the status
if you
quo.
don't want a backdoor on quantum encryption, aren't you
Right.
saying that it's bad to have backdoors in general?
Not in this instance, because if we can create quantum encryption before our enemies do, then we have already established that public-private trust, and there's not a risk of like terrorists with inferior technology being able to beat back.
Okay, what's stopping us from just funding quantum encryption in its own right?
It might be a good idea, but the status quo isn't going to do that to like enough to outpace other people, and you're defending the status quo.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I also, before I start, want to thank everyone for being here, our coach and our teammates and everything for showing up. We really appreciate it. And everyone else who took time out of their day also to show up, and my partner, and our opponents. With that being said, today's debate boils down really to two main points. And one is being the security in the economy, while the other deals with privacy. We'll deal with this sort of nonsensical idea of technology advancement and quantum mechanics later, but understandingly, we're going to see that that's not a physical, tangential point within today's debate, and it's nothing that they can show will indefinitely happen, while we can show the damage to the economy and those to privacy happens instantaneously. So with that being said, they already described how this idea of backdoor encryption would be working, and how we would either have two systems. One, you'd have a universal key where you'd be able to solve for this encryption, or the second being that we would have a flaw in the algorithm that we create, and then whenever it be needed, we can give that information to the government so they can try to solve this. Either way you look at it, there's dire consequences that we're going to be seeing to the security and to the business aspects of our economy. And we can see that these consequences are several-fold. But first, let's remind everybody that today's businesses and in the status quo, and when we're talking about anything in the digital age, it is very susceptible to hacking in the status quo. It's very likely, as we saw just last week with Yahoo, that a lot of companies and even large businesses that we think are very safe and secure are susceptible to hacking from other organizations. Take, for example, the DNC that they brought up, or the State Department. All these organizations that we see as infallible can actually have flaws within their code and be hacked. What's on the contrary, what they didn't notice, is that by creating a backdoor way, what is only going to happen is an increase in the amount of hacking attempts based off of foreign governments, NGOs, groups like ISIS, and lone wolves, just to gain that information, because it's all consolidated in one specific area. And once they hack that one instance, they have access to everybody's information. And this is dire. But even if we don't want to talk about how this is going to be destructive for those groups and the whole economy as a whole, we can take a look at the individual businesses. So even if they don't want to show, again, that the hacking is going to be a big issue, and they want to argue that this is secure, what we can realize is that the damage to businesses is based off of perception. So even if we have these sort of ideas of security, what's going to happen is once the government passes a plan to allow for backdoor encryption, American citizens are going to be scared of what's going to be happening with their information and automatically withdraw from these businesses. Investors aren't going to be as comfortable within these products. American citizens are going to go to more protected products around the globe, and not just in the country. What this means is a massive withdrawal from all those massive businesses. And of course, we can talk about how Amazon makes billions of dollars a day within trades, but also we can take a look at cybersecurity, which according to the Harvard Business Review of September 16th, holds upwards of 8% of the GDP of all G20 countries. Now, that instantaneously would be dropped with having a backdoor, because there's no need for those encryption and securities in the future, meaning that's absolutely destructive to that entire sector. And if we drop that 8%, as a scaling for reference, the American recession in 2009, the GDP only dropped 2.8%, and that's solely in the US. So a drop in 8% around the globe is a massive, massive destruction to the economy. But as if business orientation wasn't enough, let's talk about the harm to privacy. So first of all, backdoors only exist for the government to have access to your information, like your credit card number, your social security number, but also your text and email. And of course, they're going to argue that this is going to be handled responsibly, but as whistleblowers from the NSA, like Edward Snowden, has shown, that our data is not kept secure. And in doing so, we see that the damages are threefold. The first being that as Americans, we have this inherent right to privacy. It's given with us the penumbras of the Bill of Rights, as well as the Fourth Amendment state that we have this right to do so. Second, that privacy is an essential component to having civil discourse, especially against political facets in today's digital age. It's important to have that anonymity when you're going against the ideas of the traditional government to say what you believe is correct online, and without that anonymity, your identity can be compromised and you could be in danger. But third, let's also talk about how in order to have a meaningful control over your identity, you need to be able to separate what's public from what's private. Now, if what you hold as private gets pushed into the public, it means you lose that sense of control over your identity, and you get this sort of uncomfortable feeling behind it. You lose the sense of dignity that you have that would normally be kept in the private life. Now, for example, if your medical records were released or your tax records were released, you wouldn't feel comfortable with the whole public having access to this, especially if you were a business owner or someone who highly respected in the community. And losing that sense of dignity and privacy completely destroys someone's credibility in the future and completely de-dignifies them, something that we should try to stop with today's debate. Now, just to quickly go over part of their quantum mechanic point, we can see that one, this is all conjecture. It's something that they say, yeah, Google is trying to work on it, but they can never secure this in the future. Thank you.
Ready?
Yep.
All right, so you give the example of the NSA. The NSA was violating the Fourth Amendment because they weren't using warrants. They're just indiscriminately taking everyone's data. How is that the same as backdoors where law enforcement has to get a warrant?
That's not true because according to the Fourth Amendment, you don't need to have warrants to take and collect mass bulk of data. And
No,
that's
I
the same
think,
can be
I
analyzed
think that
here.
legally, under the Fourth Amendment, there are reasonable searches and seizures that's on the books, right?
Yes, but something like collection of mass data has been ruled by the FISA courts, the secret surveillance courts, as you don't need a warrant for them.
All right, well, the Supreme Court also ruled, answering your public-private point, that if you give your data to third-party businesses, that you don't own it anymore. Why is that a problem for privacy?
That's a problem for privacy because that's just inherently incorrect. You don't not own your social
was a
security number or
SCOTUS
credit card
ruling.
numbers. Yeah, what's the precedent on it?
That they ruled on it.
What's the case?
I don't know the name of the case. It's true, though. Google it. All right, on businesses, when you bought your phone, did you really consider what the product's relationship was to government surveillance?
Absolutely.
Really? Oh, I didn't, and I think these folks didn't, so you must be unique in that case, but all right. On the question of security, you say that businesses and governments are susceptible right now. Isn't that a reason why we have to take action and why we have to embrace a backdoor?
No, our second point talks about how taking action will actually incentivize more hacking to occur, but in reality...
But you also say hacking's happening now, so we should do something, right?
Yeah, but by creating a backdoor, you only create more opportunities for hacking, nor does it make it safer.
Okay.
So there's no way that your innovation happens. It also causes that crash of the whole privacy sector.
All right.
So it even
yeah, I
causes
got that.
worse
So
issues.
about that vulnerability point, you say it's all consolidated in one place. Why would the FBI just keep everybody's data in one database?
No, the point is you either have one, the algorithm is consolidated, so once the algorithm is released, you're easily able to take that information, apply it to every account, or two, the master key is consolidated in one place, and in that way they could just open up any information. So
Okay.
either way, it's consolidated.
All right, thanks.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Any opportunity to debate, especially such a pressing topic, is absolutely wonderful, and I thank you for sharing your enthusiasm and your support for coming out with us today. And with that, we'll begin the rebuttal speech. Resolved, encryption technology should have backdoors. As Ben and I have already been arguing, we firmly believe that encryption technology does support not only security, privacy, but also overwhelmingly that it should be fixed in the status quo in terms of allowing backdoors to be allowed for encryption technology. We can see this in the three main arguments we've already seen throughout the debate. Both sides have already considered strongly the value of security, the value of privacy, especially in regards to businesses, and the value of what will happen in the future in terms of where we will go from here on out, whether or not we provide backdoors for encryption or whether we don't, those two paths. So let's first look at, under the status quo, the idea of security and how my opponents are purporting the false claim that we are in fact secure in terms of our private data in the status quo, even without backdoors. The fact of the matter is, no matter what in the status quo, because this resolution deals with whether or not we should have backdoors, we have to consider what non-state actors, NGOs, and even other private governments, including what our governments are doing. No matter what, if we pass this resolution or not, governments and these actors will continue to bypass our security, even within private companies. Rather, if we are to allow some sort of legal precedent in which governments could work in operation with our private companies, we would see that there would be less security breaches because both branches could work in tandem with each other. When we have this private and public partnership between the two, we see that security will be ultimately boosted by both because they have a sharing in technology and we have a sharing in terms of security, in terms of the fact that the government wants to protect your privacy from these third-party attackers, whether they're attackers from the Sony hackers from North Korea, or whether there's again a non-state actor trying to access your information. When we have a public and private partnership, we see that there is a vested interest to protect information on both counts. The fact of the matter is, when we have the government on your side in terms of trying to protect your information, rather than a third party trying to sell your information or trying to buy your information from Google or Apple, we see an overabundance and resolve of an increased insecurity. Second of all, let's look onto privacy. The fact of the matter is, you do not have the right to privacy in this current age based off the agreements that you forego when you access and utilize any of your social media or any of the data which you forego already. In many of the agreements in which you allow for your data to be spilled onto the internet, you forego your right to privacy and you give up your information to those third parties, as Ben already stated in the cross-examination. The fact of the matter is, those private companies, despite what Apple purported in the San Bernardino case when they stated that they didn't want to give private information to public law case, despite that they had broken that precedent over 80 times since 2008, proves that private companies simply don't have your best interests at heart. Rather, companies like Apple, like my opponents are currently using in this debate, show that they will gladly sell your information simply to increase the profits of their company. Rather, again, if we have this vested interest between government and private companies, we don't see our information being sold to third parties. We don't see breaches in the security. Again, lastly, moving on to the last argument you have to consider today as to why you should vote in the affirmative world, in which security is bolstered by creating backdoors and partnerships between private companies and governments who have your best interests in terms of security and providing law enforcement, is that ultimately security will be upheld. Not only with the idea of quantum encryption, which would only enforce your security in the future, we also see that when we have a partnership between law enforcement and private entities, we have an increase in terms of how much security we can provide. For example, multiple times in the state of California, law enforcement has utilized backdoors to arrest and stop the spread of child pornography and sex trafficking when it is utilized on the internet. The fact of the matter is, when we have, again, that partnership between public and private, we only bolster our security. We bolster the effectiveness of law and order. And additionally, as Director James Comey said, the idea of accessing warrants is simply outdated in the big data age. Rather than to prevent our governments from going dark and to accessing this information, regardless of whether or not we pass this resolution in the status quo, we see that if we again have that partnership between private and public, we ultimately bolster the security, not only in terms of safety with law enforcement, in terms of having your information more secure, in terms of reacting to attacks such as the San Bernardino much quicker, rather than waiting multiple months to have access to needed information to provide justice. But furthermore, we simply see an overall booster in the terms of technology which we can create together. It is for that reason that you must affirm the resolution, because in the status quo, your privacy and your security is already violated. Let's make it a little bit stronger.
Ready?
Yes.
So what companies are able to do this public-private partnership with the government?
Well, currently we see that Apple, which is like the computer that you're already using, has already handed over information to the federal government over 70 times since the year 2008. So that's already a partnership.
Isn't that a lot different than just giving them a universal key so the FBI can go in any time that they want?
We're not necessarily advocating for a singular universal key.
That's
Rather,
a
we're
backdoor, right?
That is an example of a backdoor, but we've already established that there are multiple examples in which the governments can operate to utilize backdoors, as you stated in your resolution, in
Yeah,
your
but both
beginning.
of them would do the same thing, give absolute universal access to the government.
No, what we're preventing here is we're preventing the government from circumventing the private company and about that they need to access that information. And so what they're doing, if they circumvent without a backdoor, that's already creating a data breach in the company. Either way, you're having less security in the company, so we should have more backdoors.
It sounds like you're just saying instead of the government having to sneak behind the company's back, we're just going to be giving them the information in the first place, which still lets the government have all of your information.
Not necessarily. It's only in the case of law enforcement under a warrant.
Well, it doesn't have to be under a warrant, just like the NSA doesn't have to be under a warrant to do so. We talked about that in the last cross-ex. But the next question I wanted to ask is, why is security bolstered for the government and for these private companies simply because they're allowed to work together?
If they work together, that means, again, as we established, the government isn't going behind the private company's security.
How does that increase the amount of privacy and security that's
because the more private attacks you have behind a company, that means the more that their security is, defaulted. It's like if you attack a brick wall, bricks are going to fall down. That leaves it more vulnerable to other attackers.
So then why didn't we kind of address this in terms of the businesses that are going to be hurt in today's debate that I brought up in my previous speech?
Well, actually, what we can find is that when we look, as you said, that you consider the usage of what companies give information to the government, that you say you strongly consider that when you make a purchase. And yet Apple is a company which has been resoundingly known to give information to the government repeatedly, and I see you using the product. That's the same case for so many Americans and so many people around the world. The claim that business will be lost in the case of the increase of backdoors is simply a false claim, and one perpetrated by companies that don't have a valid claim with that.
Well, as Hillary Clinton said, whew. It's a whole lot of stuff we got to deal with today and a whole lot of issues that we need to talk about. So I think I'd like to first talk a little bit about why security is better without having a backdoor. So the first point I'd like to talk about is that having a backdoor intrinsically just kind of makes your systems less secure. So I mean, if you think about having a house, right? A house is more secure if it has one door because you can't go in through the back door. So in this sense, yeah, it doesn't make sense when they're talking about how our systems would be more secure if we add a backdoor. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. But then secondly, when they're talking about terrorism and these things that are really, really important to us as Americans, it doesn't help us to have our tech be the ones with backdoors. Terrorists aren't going to buy Apple products if the US announces that the Apple products they're buying are going to be tracked. Terrorists are going to realize that they need to just go buy Samsung products or go buy Xiaomi products from China. And this just really means that we're not going to be solving for any of the crime that's already occurring because people will just go to other markets. And of course, this also ties in to what my partner was talking about with having the economy crash, because we're just going to see people go to other markets. But then the last point, which is the most scary to me at least, is that if you have one key that engineers know. So, I mean, imagine if some developers have to make this system. You have to have an entire team of engineers who know exactly how this algorithm is flawed. They know exactly how their one little person can just go in and see any person's information on the world. Like, that's crazy. That's a lot of power in that one person's hands. So just think about it. If you're a Purdue engineer, you're developing this cool, awesome backdoor technology for for the government, and then Russia comes at you with $10 billion, you're going to be like, heck yeah, I'm just going to like go to Russia now. I mean, people are vulnerable to these kinds of security risks from other sovereign nations, and this is really dangerous to our US privacy. So just look, for example, to even without these bribes or these other kind of deals, look to how the DNC has been hacked. Look to how all of these people have been hacked before. And if they get the access to just this one key, they have access to everything. Now that's terrifying. So let's look at why this affects privacy as well as the economy. So my partner talks about why privacy is highly important. So the IU team is coming up here and telling us, hey, we need to get this legal background. And I mean, sure, having a legal precedent for this is highly important. But you don't need to have a backdoor in order to have a legal precedent. You can just go and talk to the court. You can bring a case to the Supreme Court if you want this legal precedent. This has nothing to do with whether or not we have an encryption backdoor. Now, the second point I'd like to talk about here is why privacy is so important. If we look to historically different countries that have been spying on their citizens, we see that these countries are ones who end up just taking advantage of their citizens. They're monitoring them so that you can't dissent against the popular opinion. And that's something that we don't like, because in the US, we value being able to dissent whenever we want without the government looking over our shoulder. And then the final point here, they talk about innovation. So the fact of the matter is that innovation is also independent of whether or not we have a backdoor. So for example, if you want to develop electric cars, you don't need to like make some kind of policy change to just force people to like shift their focus onto electric cars. You can just fund it. Like you don't need to create the security backdoor for us in order to just start working on quantum encryption. Like just to look to all the rhetoric they've talked about. Google's already working on quantum encryption. People are working on quantum encryption. This innovation is nothing unique to what we're going to be doing with this security backdoor. And so in summary, because we're not going to be helping the security risks at all, and because the economy and privacy are all going to be hurt, we think that having a privacy backdoor is something that's really ultimately bad. Thank you.
Hi, you good to begin?
Uh-huh,
Great.
of course.
Okay, so the main argument I really want to look at is you guys' claim that when we have announcements that backdoors are created or that hacks are created, that people pull out from business. What evidence can you draw from that directly shows this link? Like, can you draw any links from maybe the Sony hacks or maybe the Yahoo incidents that you guys referenced?
Right, so I think the difference between those instances and today's instant that we're talking about is that we don't have this overarching huge policy change that every device has a backdoor. I think having the backdoor and having it announced as a global policy decision, that's a huge turnoff from US tech companies.
But was it any less of a turnoff for people to, continue purchasing Apple products when it has been blatantly announced time and time again that Apple will forego and give your information not only to the federal government, but it will sell it to other companies and other entities to make profit off of your privacy?
So I think these are like totally different things, because when you're talking about selling data, that means like giving your email address away. That's definitely different from being able to read your intimate texts with your best friend at late night about like an exam you just had, or something like that. I think these are widely different issues that can't really be compared.
How is it different when Amazon can sell your tracking, the way you purchase your purchase information, so businesses can target what you're going to buy, maybe what you want to buy next, and how they can target their advertisement? How is that, any less of a forego of security? Why do I want any of my security given to those private companies for profit rather than for law enforcement and security reasons?
Sure. So I mean, like if you just think intuitively about this, it's kind of different if I'm going to be telling someone my heart's story, if I was like an orphan or something, and I just had to talk about this with someone. I think that's widely different from seeing what kind of products I'm buying. I think that's just not a comparison that we can be making today.
If you wouldn't mind, one last question. Why should we wait for a legal precedent to arise in terms of accessing information that may prevent, a further terrorist attack, or may, conclude the research and the justice given to a terrorist attack, such as in San Bernardino? Why do we need to wait several months for the FBI to go through legal battle with Apple in order to get needed information that would simply be, in any other case, given by a warrant?
So that was a very long question. But so I think that, having this legal precedent is really important so that we don't have an oppressive government and so that we can protect our privacy. I think that if we trade our privacy and our liberty for security, that's not something we really want to do. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. The negative speeches have been very persuasive, but their big mistake here is conceding the massive impacts of terrorism. If we can win that privacy is being violated in the status quo, then you should make your decision based on any risk that we can solve this. First is our McCall evidence, which shows this has been the highest frequency of terrorist attacks since 9/11, and they've been more destructive. They are very bad for businesses. The example of North Korea and other individual hackers, okay, to quote Trump, could be Russia, could be China, right? But is drained billions of dollars from our economy. Cyber terror is also on the rise. Terrorists are able to, we articulate Al-Qaeda as an example, could also be ISIS or Al-Shabaab. They can remotely control payloads of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. And an attack on the grid would cause widespread instability, could destroy the economy irreversibly, which is much worse for the economy than minute problems of competitiveness, and would also risk meltdowns of power plants. And a backdoor is also better for civil liberties because it has the chance of exonerating innocent people. Now, they say that terrorists would just use different phones, but you can't find any phone that doesn't that we're not able to track in a world of international modeling where all corporations are on board. They can see that we have that international modeling happening through multilateral agreements. Answering vulnerability, we just completely outweigh this. Even if there is a risk that that bad actors get their hands on the back doors, we have the same technology. We can beat them tit for tat because we have a much stronger agency than they do, and there have been smaller instances of backdoors a long time. People or hackers always would rather do things like find programming errors. A backdoor is really only useful for law enforcement. Now, on the question of privacy. First, extend our arguments about how the backdoor is capable of solving privacy. First, James Lewis proves that embracing a backdoor prevents patchwork policies and creates a precedent that builds trust with companies and the private, which leads to transparency and agreed upon standards. And this precedent is applied globally. Now, that precedent also legal checks in the status quo prevent abuse. Only law enforcement will be allowed to use it, and they have to get a warrant, just like any search or seizure. Now, they say that any person can be tracked, but this isn't true. You have to get a warrant for it, which means there has to be probable cause. If you're only a threat if there's probable cause you're doing drug trafficking or if you're a terrorist. And this is the best compromise because the worst world for privacy is one where a successful large-scale terrorist attack happens because that justifies a government crackdown. I think the Patriot Act is a good example of that after 9/11, how they were able to whip up public support for doing that is much worse for civil liberties. Now, on the question of business. They say that companies are innovating in the status quo, but innovation is always based on incentives and investor confidence. A backdoor sends a signal so that investors are like, okay, I can pull the trigger on moving my money from one investment into things like quantum encryption or other kinds of technology which spill over into other sectors helping the economy, but also just improve security overall. And this is a question of degree. The technology is a long way away, so we need to do it faster than our enemies and kind of beat them there. Now, our Lewis evidence also indicates international agreements create a model, which means the whole developing world gets on board. That means there's no like domestic competitiveness issues because all countries and all of their businesses have the same backdoor. There's no incentive to buy from a foreign country instead of ours. And the strength of the US tech industry probably just overwhelms that trend anyway. No other country has an Apple or a Google or a Microsoft. And there are other ways that we access reasons we can solve economic problems better than theirs. First, a terrorist attack, like I gave with the grids example, would devastate the economy. But second, cyber attacks on businesses have been skyrocketing. And third, we spur that innovation and new technology. That's the quantum encryption argument. So you should vote F.
In true fashion of today's debate, the government or the affirmative side is justifying everything by throwing words like terrorism at you to make you feel that it's important and it's inherent that we take the information of private citizens in order to secure a better nation. But in reality, when we take a look at how our data has been misused by the government, who was trying to protect us in names of security beforehand, we've only been misguided by those sources. So there's no reason that we should today believe that we're going to have a malfeasance in our government to be able to guide our way down this lovely path of security and protection within our private interests, when in actuality, all it's going to do is cause for more cyber terrorism. So let's take a step back in today's debate and evaluate line by line to see why you're not going to be looking towards the idea of a backdoor, but seeing why as a whole backdoors are bad for our economy, for our security, and for privacy. First of all, they have this notion that because we have like international partnerships, once we pass this legislation, it'll spread everywhere. That's not true. Only take into consideration today's debate in the context of the US, because we can't assume that forever, for some reason, every other government's going to adopt this. In actuality, it's going to incentivize other governments not to adopt it, because we already explained how people are going to pull out of US markets once we pass this, because the perception that your data is more vulnerable causes them to leave. That means if countries like China stay out of this adoption of this, it means that they're going to see a massive boost in their economy because more people are going to be investing in their sectors. Or Japan with Samsung. If Samsung chooses not to go along with this, that means people are going to switch from Apple phones, which are regulated by the US, to Samsung phones in places like China, or in places like Japan, where they don't have to worry about these issues, meaning that we're just losing more GDP and business for the US and causing that to go elsewhere, a point that's completely dropped and uncontested by the affirmative side today. But in general, let's talk about this public-private privacy and partnership that they expunge will solely help the United States economy and help businesses and government alike. Unfortunately, this isn't the symbiotic relationship that they protrude it to be. In fact, a lot of these private companies that are going to be benefiting from the US government can't actually help improve the security, one, of the US government or their own companies. They're only going to be leeching off the government's sense of security in order to try to benefit their websites. But in actuality, we can see that neither what they're trying to propose with the backdoor nor the status quo encryption is good enough to stop hackers, which is why we shouldn't be just giving that technology around everywhere and hoping it's going to stop cyber terrorism from happening in the future. What we only need to realize is that by giving a backdoor, it causes more problems. Why does that occur? In my first speech and my partner both talked about how giving a backdoor incentivizes more cyber terrorism from happening with ISIS and North Korea and Russia and these foreign governments, because all the information or all the keys to the universal sense of information is kept in one area. You only need to hack one account to get the master key, or one account to find the flaw in the algorithm, and you have access to every single account elsewhere. Means that these governments and foreign agencies only need to go towards one area to make sure that they can stop and create distrust everywhere. So even if they want to argue that law enforcement's important, it's not going to be more important than the destruction of the United States economy. There's no reason that we should justify this. In fact, privacy checks for this instance. Now, again, they completely drop the fact that we have this inherent right of privacy, that you will have to, or that they do not have to use a warrant like the NSA and the status quo, and that we have this sense of uncomfortable feeling that we have to maintain and fight for to make sure that it doesn't happen when we violate our privacy. And they just protrude that terrorism is the most important we need to solve. But they're not solving terrorism with their plan of a backdoor. Again, it only exacerbates the problem because it incentivizes more areas to attack those openings within the government or those private businesses, only causing more problem and destruction. In fact, if we keep with the status quo, if we're able to envision in technology like the quantum mechanics, but without creating a backdoor, we're able to solve for this technology problem in the future, create a much more successful United States and a more secure globe. So let's do the ideas of advancement of technology, but without this whole backdoor issue, because it just causes more problems.
Thank you very much. Purdue debaters, are we done? Would you like to take some questions from the audience?
Sure.
Do we have any questions out there? No, I think you guys must have done a good job.
I have a question. So at times I wasn't sure what I was seeing. So now that we've seen it, could you go over the various steps that we just saw through the, for lack of a better term, the choreography?
Should I go up to the mic or can you all hear me? If the question is one of format, usually in the debates that we would do at tournaments, there will be 2 constructive speeches and 2 rebuttal speeches, which means each person gets 2 speeches throughout the round. But in this case, we had 2 constructive speeches, which is designed to kind of set up our arguments, put on the table what we're going to be talking about. And then the rebuttals at the end are kind of taking a step back and using the moving parts that have already been happening and doing kind of calculus as to how we should go about making the decision given the different impacts on both sides. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm a big government kind of guy. I think government does a lot of good things. That said, I don't believe the government should be involved in this, promoting this backdoor situation. If a company lets your data go, that company can be sued for the full value that that company has until, you shut them down. The government, we've learned, so if you have a backdoor required by the government, if that backdoor is how the hack occurs, the company can lay all of the blame for that backdoor hack onto the government. They can argue that. And we've learned from things like the State Fair tragedy when the stage fell and killed people and hurt people. We learned that the state can pass laws that say for any given incident, our maximum liability is only $200,000. Well, $200,000 didn't come close to dealing with the liability and the damage that occurred from that State Fair tragedy. So that's one of the reasons that having the state require companies to do something, but then being able to cap their liability on that, to me seems like a real problem.
Well, thank you so much. This is really insightful.
All right, well, I guess it was great being here, and thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you so much.